I learned from a brilliant investor when I was a really, really young kid. He said, David, I'm going to die long before you, but I don't want my advice to die. So always remember, no such thing as too early, only too late. And I've never forgotten that since I was 14 years old. And I practice it. And it means in this case, don't let a mess ensue. Don't get into the studio and you're working there for 2 months and then you bring up, hey guys, when am I getting my first paycheck? And then on the flip side, don't be so early that you jump the gun and you're making assumptions. So you really have to get a sense and a feel for like, what's the right time? When is everybody expecting to go to the table, get the business stuff over with? Because the crux of a music business deal usually has a lot of creative elements to it. And when those creative elements are flowing and they're creating the value of what the deal is there to protect in the first place, you don't want the business stuff getting in the way.
Brian Smith here, and welcome to the Dreampath podcast, where I try to get inside the heads of talented creatives from all over the world. My goal is to demystify and humanize the creative process and make it accessible to everyone. Now let's jump in. David Frangioni's on the show today. David is one of the most eclectic people I've ever met. He juggles what probably amounts to 3 or 4 full-time careers in music and entertainment, all at the same time. He's the current publisher of Modern Drummer magazine. He has also been the music technologist for Aerosmith for over 30 years, and his past clients include the Rolling Stones, Ringo Starr, Elton John, Sting, Journey, Styx, Kiss, Ozzie Osborne, Phil Collins, Shakira, Cher, and many other iconic performers. When he worked with Ozzie, David appeared on Ozzie's reality TV series, The Osbournes. If you go to his website, davidfrangioni.com, you can see testimonials from Steven Tyler, Bryan Adams, Paul Stanley of Kiss, and Ozzie, all praising David's skills in the recording studio. David also designs and builds custom professional recording studios, and even built Steven Tyler's personal studio. And on top of all of these endeavors, in his spare time, he writes books. His book, Clint Eastwood Icon, The Essential Film Art Collection, was published in a second edition in 2018. He's also the author of the 2018 book, Crash, The World's Greatest Drum Kits, and is now working on a biography entitled No Plan B. But perhaps the most impressive thing about David is his work with charities. He donates the profits from his book sales to charities that help kids through music and music education. David works with charities like Musicians on Call, where musicians play room to room at children's hospitals. He is also the founder of the Frangioni Foundation, with a mission to engage, teach, inspire, heal, and enrich the lives of young people through the power of music. So let's jump right into my talk with drummer, music technologist, and philanthropist, David Frangioni.
David Frangioni, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for making time for me.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Brian. Thank you for having me. Great to be here, everyone.
Yeah, well, I've done some research on you and your background, and there is so much to unpack. Your bio is just amazingly eclectic and layered. So let me start off by just asking you to tell us, what was your calling in terms of finding the drums as your instrument of choice?
You know, I wish I knew. If we go even before I was born, my parents, my dad was in World War II. They got married they met and got married right after that. All they wanted was a family. They're of Italian descent, and family was everything to them. And it took them almost 20 years of trying to have children. They had my brother, my older brother, by 3 years. They don't know how or why they could have kids, but they just all of a sudden had my brother. Then they had me 3 years later. And in that process of my being very, very young, like literally a year and a half, somewhere drums showed up around the house. I don't know if it's because I was banging on things and giving them an inkling that was an interest, or if they brought it to me. I wish they were still alive, that I could ask them. And I wish I had asked them back then, but it's just in my blood. It's from that young of an age. There's a picture of me playing the drums at 18, 19 months old. And then I was diagnosed at age 2 with retinoblastoma, which is cancer of the eye. And of course, my family was riveted. Things would never be the same again. On top of dealing with the cancer and the life-threatening nature of it. The doctors had to remove my right eye. So I've been blind in one eye ever since. They put a prosthetic in. It made for a very, very challenging childhood and to some extent life. And I just worked really hard and followed my passion to, pursue everything that I really wanted to do in life and not let anything hold me back. And I got those values as well from my mom and dad.
Well, it sounds like, David, that you were introduced to music very early in life, but it wasn't just how early in life you started playing drums. It was also in a time that was a very formative experience for you in terms of basically battling to survive. Do you think that played a role in how ingrained music was into your psyche and your being?
Yes. And I think that, and I also think that it played a huge role in my approach to life, which is really, you can sum it up in 3 words, which is do it now.
Yeah.
I think that's the combination that was embedded as a result of the trauma, as a result of my youth, my really earliest years, that's still with me today.
So the other part of your biography that I read, and I read a lot, there's a lot out there, that you actually started as an entrepreneur in music at the age of 16. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, it was even before that. I mean, when I started playing the drums, I was playing on phone books and tabletops and everywhere else. I was taking drum lessons before I even had a drum kit. And I got very serious about wanting to be a good drummer. And my parents were very focused on using education as an important tool to being a good drummer, to being good at anything, really. So I was taking lessons, studying in school, drumming, joining every band and every opportunity I had in school, and then also trying to form bands with neighborhood kids and kids that I heard about, referrals. So by the time I was 12, I was actually out there playing in bands pretty regularly, 13, 14 years old, booking my own bands, calling clubs that I wasn't even old enough to get into, trying to play at school dances, like anywhere I could play, I wanted to. And then what happened around 16, 17 years old is I started to transition from wanting to be the world's greatest drummer, which I was a long way from becoming, but that was my goal, and to being into technology. And I found technology through drumming, and I took to technology as much as I had taken to drums, where I was just really passionate about it, had a real drive towards it, pursued it with a great intensity, and tried to learn a tremendous amount about it, and got to the point where within a year, I was able to open MIDI consulting business. And that was really that was like the start of what I would call successful and somewhat substantive, small businesses. That was my first small business.
And about what year was that when you started the MIDI consulting?
Like 86, 87.
And so for our listeners that don't know what MIDI is, what is that an acronym for, and what is it?
MIDI is an acronym for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, and it's a programming language. It's a protocol for all instruments, electronic instruments, to communicate over the same standard. So prior to the introduction of MIDI, you had Roland put out a device, and the only thing it could talk to, either rhythmically or trigger notes or whatever it would be another Roland device. They'd all have some kind of proprietary synchronization protocol. Yamaha would do the same thing. Oberheim would do the same thing, etc. So MIDI comes along, and now all of a sudden, if every manufacturer puts a MIDI jack and implements the MIDI protocol into the device, now you can have everything talking to everything. So when I really started discovering that, coupled with triggering drums and expanding my palette of what could be done through playing the drums and programming drum machines, it was and is an absolute limitless universe. And your imagination tries to catch up to all of the powerful tools that you have and the possibilities. And that's just incredibly inspiring. I mean, it truly is limitless.
So let's go back a little bit and talk about your experience in bands. at the age of 12 and 13. And what were your parents thinking about this, these activities that are pretty cutting edge and adventurous for a 12-year-old?
I know. I look back, and they were the most supportive, loving parents. We had very little means, blue collar. My dad was a meat cutter, loved to cook. My mom was a legal secretary. They didn't have any money. They just had, they had what was important, which was love and family values. And it really taught me the definition of gratitude and humility, coming from nothing and seeing how hard they worked their whole lives till they passed away. Really, they were working. And, but they had, a support mechanism for me and a love and, I guess, push, if you will, like to make me better, that I don't even understand to this day, because I can't imagine how they let me play clubs that young, and let me play and do what I did. Thank God I was a good kid. I've never in my life had a puff of a cigarette, a drink, a drug of any kind, from marijuana to whatever you want, just nothing. So I have no substances in my body of any kind, other than I love to eat, and I probably don't eat the healthiest all the time. But as far as any kind of drugs or alcohol or smoke, it never happened. So I think that was a huge factor in when I wanted to go out and play, and I would be in some of these dicey environments. They always cared, and they were on top of where I was and what I was doing, but there's no question they were very, very lenient and forgiving, whereas most parents would never let me do what I did. And fortunately, I made them proud. I didn't get into trouble. I didn't, hang out at the clubs or do anything. I just wanted to play. I think I was just really lucky that my parents let me and trusted me enough to do that.
Yeah, and it sounds like your passion for playing and performing and learning was pretty pure, because, putting myself in the shoes of, a 12-year-old drummer who's actually playing clubs, I can see myself getting pulled into the mystique of the whole lifestyle, the alcohol, cigarettes, the drugs.
Oh, it was there. It was there. I just hated it. Fortunately for me, whatever's in my brain, it was such an instant turnoff. As soon as I smelled smoke or alcohol and saw the environments that I was playing in, I'm on the stage, right? Even though these are small, divey places, I'm on the stage and I can see the crowd in front of me, or in a lot of cases, lack thereof, but the chairs and tables in front of me and the bartenders. And I just was so turned off. And then later, as I got a little older, that turnoff was coupled with a really intense desire and focus. I was just able to learn early on about working hard and having values and a work ethic. And that's really served me my whole life. And I got that from my parents, of course, that nothing will be accomplished if you don't put the work in, if you're not smart about it, if you don't have the, education and background to really be prepared to, go against whatever challenge you have and go for the goals that you want to accomplish. It really comes from a foundation.
Yeah, there's this concept of 10,000 hours, and I've read about.
I subscribe to it.
Yeah, and it sounds like you started your 10,000 hours really early, at the age of maybe 2. And so by the time you are 16 and you've played the clubs and you've grinded out a lot of the work, just the daily grind of a club musician, you accomplished that 10,000 hours and became, very, very competent in drumming and performing way earlier than most people. That's what it sounds like, anyway.
Well, it's true. It was a blessing. I mean, I'm a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell and the 10,000 hour philosophy I agree with. I probably, I've talked about this before. I think I have 3 10,000 hour businesses that I could say. And you're right, drumming and performing and being a part of that is one of them. And of course, technology would be another one. And then developing artists and the music business side of things, which is all kind of one wheelhouse, would be a third one. And so I think that, I think it's important if you really want to be good at it and be able to grow even further than that. Anything that we want to be good at, it never has an end zone, right? So no matter how far you take it, no matter how many hit songs or great artists or great business deals or whatever it is that you're keeping track of to see how your goals are going and how your successes are going, there's no point where it's like, okay, I've done it all. I've accomplished it all. I'm the best player, the best businessman or whatever. It never ends. So I think that the 10,000 hours is huge to get to some real milestones and be able to accomplish some big successes. That's really still part of the journey, as opposed to like, okay, I hit 10,000 hours, now I'm good. There's no such thing as that really in all of the things that we have to accomplish in life.
Yeah, especially with the changing landscape, the way that we went from analog to digital from the 70s to the 80s. And it sounds like you stayed very tuned in to the technology side of music, so that by the mid 80s, you become this, according to Bryan Adams, this MIDI guru. What was so important about the digital technology that changed the musical landscape in the 1980s?
It was the beginning of eternity. We're always going to have that as the beginning of a sea change that will keep developing forever. That now there is a common unified standard, and it's been used and adopted by every manufacturer and everybody. And it really was breakthrough. And to this day, of course, it's taken for granted because it's been around for a while now. But back then it was so cutting edge. And I was working with a lot of manufacturers, software developers, Pro Tools, which back then was Sound Designer, then Sound Tools, then Pro Tools, working with Opcode and Passport and Alchemy, sample editors, and just so many pieces of technology that just formed the basis from which so much of the powerful, studio tools that we have now were really born from that. And I think that was a really, really amazing time that ended up, in hindsight now, becoming the beginning of digital recording and music technology that we'll have forever.
And for our listeners who aren't very savvy technologically and don't really know the difference between digital and analog, back in the 60s and 70s, we really were dealing with actual tape, right? I mean, we're talking about like tape recordings of a drum track and a vocal track that you're splicing things together.
Yep.
When the digital age hits, you can completely dispense with all of the tape and really become more productive. Is that a fair way to put it?
Well, we have to add one little piece to that, which is the tape. The analog tape was first. It's mono, stereo, 4-track, 8-track. It grew in tracks to ultimately 24-track was really the maximum, and then you would synchronize 24-track machines together to get more tracks. And then what happened is tape stayed but went to digital tape.
Oh, okay.
And so we had digital tape in the 80s, which was the 80s were again another huge time period where digital tape was taking over for analog tape. Both formats, very expensive, very much you needed like technology person to install and maintain. Then by the early 90s, we had affordable modular digital multi-tracks, and now everybody can have digital recording at their house using at the time ADATs and Tascam DA88s. Some people credit me with building the first home studio. It was all based around those kinds of technologies, late 80s, early 90s. And then as the 90s went on, digital took a huge turn, and I'm very excited that I was able to be a part of all of this at the cutting edge, at the development side of it. It took a huge turn to where Pro Tools went from a sidecar kind of technology where you'd have the tape rolling and then you'd have a Pro Tools rig off to the side and you could use it to edit and fly things around and kind of augment what you were doing. And then by like 97, 98, all of a sudden Pro Tools became the replacement for all of these tape console combinations and technologies. And that's how we're using it today. But that's where it started, and it's evolved from there, of course, quite a bit.
Yeah. I interviewed Richard Patrick from the band Filter, and he was a former guitar player for Nine Inch Nails back in the 80s and early 90s. And he was talking about how the recording industry completely changed when people were able to basically show up with, Pro Tools and a couple of mics and lay down tracks in their house or even in a studio. And the cost of recording went dramatically down, and sort of the barrier to get into that space went dramatically down. An anecdote that he brought up was that the studio albums that Nine Inch Nails and later Filter would record would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more, to put together. And then he witnessed Eminem in another studio, knocking out an album within a matter of a couple of days for cheap. And my question to you is, what have we gained and what have we lost with removing that barrier to recording an album and having it sound pretty good? I mean, even someone who doesn't really know what they're doing, it seems like, can put out something that at least is passable. Of course, they're not going to get to, upper echelon sound quality like you accomplish. But what are the pros and the cons of having that barrier lowered or removed by technology?
Well, the pros are that you have these incredible tools that are available to everybody. So you're not limited by budgets, only creativity. The tools have become available, and the price of great quality tools, it just keeps getting more and more and more cost effective. I always say, though, it's the archer and not the arrow. So the tools are important, but it's always going to be based on whose hands those tools are in. And I've always been a big proponent of recording and music technology being as cost effective as it can be, so that everybody can use it. I think that's a huge breakthrough. When I look back on when I started, I would have to go to very high end, very well equipped, what I'll call even world-class studios in Boston, where I'm from, and seek out some opportunity to sit there and learn, right? Because you got a $500,000 console or more. You've got a synclavier, which is $100,000 to $200,000, or a Fairlight, which was the same price. And you've got a tape machine that's $50,000 to $150,000. I mean, like, you blinked your eyes and you're in $1 million room.
Yeah.
Lexicon, outboard gear, and all these different things. And so how do you learn it? If it costs $1 million just to own it and spend time with it, you really had to cut your teeth. You had to spend a lot of time for free, just wanting to be a fly on the wall. And it was almost, you felt lucky to be chosen to work for free. You felt lucky because you had access. I would go to the music stores all the time, and I would just, befriend people at the music stores, because that was another essentially control room, if you will, full of equipment that was not necessarily accessible or affordable, because we're still in the 80s now, and stuff is very expensive for the most part. But I needed to learn the gear. And in order to learn the gear, you've got to spend time with it. And then after you learn it, you have to apply it musically in a workflow that's conducive to a session. And the better you get at that, the better your clients are going to be. And by the time I got the gig with Aerosmith in '89, started working with them extensively, even through to this day, I was ready for it. I was prepared, and I was able to bring workflows and ideas and innovations to their creative process that they hadn't had prior to my being on board. And, that combination, we did Pump and Get a Grip and Big Ones and 9 Lives and Just Push Play and South of Sanity, and, just a myriad of what ended up being really successful, well-received rock music.
Nice. So what is your official credit on those albums? Is it audio engineer?
Technologist, pre-production engineer, in-house engineer, Pro Tools, MIDI. It's just I was their one-man show, in the studio until they got to all the writing was done, all the offline work was done, and then they would go and they would record with a producer for a few months to just finish putting the tracks down until Just Push Play. Then Just Push Play was done entirely in-house. Marty Fredrickson and Mark Hudson produced it. We did it at Joe and Stevens. We got an SSL brought in. God bless Mike Shipley. He's no longer with us, but at the time he mixed it. And Joe had an SSL brought into a house on his property temporarily. At that time, we're going back to 99, 2000-ish. At that time, the hybrid of Pro Tools and a large format console was still being utilized, much more so than it is today. So I was just, the go-to guy for whatever they needed.
Yeah. So what was that process like, the workflow and the actual work itself? When you have a band that is as successful as Aerosmith is, with all of these personalities, there's a lot at stake for everybody. It's expensive to bring everybody together. I would imagine there's a lot of pressure. So when you show up to a gig like that, what is expected of you in terms of what you're contributing to the process? How much time every day? I mean, are you basically just saying, all right, here's my life for 2 weeks or 2 months, or, I'm at your disposal? Or is it, I just don't understand how that dynamic would work with a band like Aerosmith.
Well, it's been 31 years. So I guess here's my life for 31 years and counting. But seriously, their process in the record making time, as I would define it, which in my tenure was pumped to Just Push Play, because they really did only 2 records since then. They did Honkin' on Bobo, which I wasn't involved in day to day, and Music from Another Dimension, which they did in LA 6 years ago or so. So they really haven't made a lot of records like we were doing it from 89 to 2001. And that was the heyday for my time with them every day. Since then, I've just been doing special projects and, just staying in the family. But that was the heavy lifting. And the process during that time was about a year of writing, where we'd be in Joe's studio or Steven's studio. Different songwriters would come in when they wanted to collaborate. The rest of the time, it would be Joe, Steven, and then the band, of course, would come in as well and collaborate. But Joe and Steven were really the main writers. And I would run the console and the computer and all that stuff. And then they would go pick a producer, spend a couple of months recording the record, mixing it, and then they'd come back to me and we'd be in, again, Joe or Stevens, and we would start doing, the liners for radio, whatever promotional things. They'd be doing, edits and radio mixes and remixes and CD single mixes and mixes from movies. I mean, I remember Mrs. Doubtfire needed a Dude Looks Like a Lady edit. Like, there was just, with that band, they had so much going on, and they still do, but then they did as well. There was never a day off, really. While I was working with them, I was also building my company, Audio One, so that I could build studios, which I still to this day is one of my core businesses, is building recording studios, digital facilities, all things, studio related or acoustic related, as well as home theaters and home automation systems, which is what Audio One does. And that started in the 90s. So I was kind of doing both in parallel, so I could have my day-to-day where it was all just strictly me, but then I could take my vision and my passion for wanting to do more rooms than just the ones I could do myself and start a company based on that. And now we can be doing studios all over the world. I could be working with Aerosmith in the studio, and I have guys putting together based on my, view, ideas, and initiative, additional studios and rigs and that kind of thing. So that was the beginning of everything that we see today in my world.
As you may have noticed, there are great resources and advice mentioned in all our episodes. And for many of them, we actually collect all of these resources for you in one easy place, our newsletter. You can go to dreampathpod.com/newsletter to join. It's not fancy, just an email about each week's episode, featured artists, and resources to help you on your journey. Thanks. And now back to the interview.
So was there a moment in time that you can remember where your passion for recording and audio and technology went from a hobby to a career? And, was it when you got a call from Aerosmith, was it a previous artist that you worked with that kind of flipped on the switch that, oh, this is actually something that is going to be, I'm going to make a career out of this?
I never really thought of any of what I'm doing as a hobby, even at the beginning. So I found electronics through drumming. And although you could call it a hobby at that time because I was just doing gigs around Boston and the bottom of what you would call a professional drummer's career as far as gigs, trying to make it, but hadn't made it. And, just really finding electronics for that reason, but always taking it very, very seriously. And then when I started my consulting business, and you could call that like turning pro for technology, I built up credits. I was networking, living in Boston. I was networking all around New England as well as New York. And there were a lot of things going on in New York. I was making a lot of phone calls because remember, this is pre-internet. So there's no emails or any kind of internet at all. So you make phone calls, you send faxes, you get on a plane and fly somewhere, you knock on somebody's door, send FedExes. That was all very manual labor, just networking and trying to build a clientele. And then with Aerosmith, I got referred to them and just went in for one small project and ended up never leaving.
And I've seen you worked with Ozzie Osborne and Bryan Adams and Cher.
Yep, 10 years with Ozzie. Bryan, great friend still to this day. We're in touch, and I'm very blessed, I never in a million years, even in my wildest dreams, thought that I could have the career that I've been able to have and have now. But it just proves that with hard work and commitment that, a lot of things are possible that you don't even realize.
What have you learned about the business side of this in terms of working with artists like Kiss and Ozzie Osborne and Cher and Aerosmith, in terms of protecting yourself through contracts and agents and things like that versus like the Shep Gordon approach, which I watched the Shep Gordon documentary.
Supermensch.
Yeah, Supermensch. And great documentary and just a fascinating man. But yeah, he talks about how I don't think he's ever had a contract with any of his clients. Everything is just, we're going to do this thing together and we're going to treat each other fairly. So what kind of balance have you struck in that respect? Because it sounds like you have these long, important relationships with artists and you're friends with them, but you also have to make a living and you have to protect yourself. And can you tell our listeners about that dynamic?
Well, yeah, you have to be aware of that and practice it. It's certainly very important. I'm a believer in everything being in writing. So I always work with contracts and written agreements. You also have to understand timing and the appropriate time and place. So I wouldn't bring a contract up to an artist the first day that we're going to start creating something, or, you got to know like when is the moment where you work out what is this arrangement. Of course, it should always be done based on a spoken agreement and you capture that in writing. I'm not a big fan of sending emails to people telling them what my ideas are or asking them what a certain deal should be in replacement of a conversation. In addition to a conversation, I'm a huge proponent of that. But as a way of not confronting, I don't think that's the best way. I think artists like to talk about what the deal's going to be, or their handlers will talk about it. It doesn't. Sometimes the artist doesn't want to talk about it, but there is somebody responsible for talking about it. And so you've just got to make sure that things are clear. I was, as I was learning and as you talked about, as here today, I started very young, so I made all kinds of mistakes, had no clue, when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, I don't have a clue about contracts and written agreements. And of course, there weren't even emails or anything to send. So everything would have had to have been a fax or an in-person contract. So I learned all that. You learn it the hard way. And I think the lesson that we'd like to have the listeners today take away is that capture everything in writing and just do it at the right time. In a traditional business deal, timing is always everything, but there's a much greater window and understanding and latitude in a traditional business deal. Like if you were going to buy a piece of real estate, it's like having closing documents and having everything in writing is a given. You don't have to worry about like, when do I show somebody the contract for a real estate transaction? It's the opposite. It's like, when am I going to see the contract? In the music business, even though everything's based around contracts as well, it's a very different dynamic because everybody knows that there's an agreement that has to be in place. But unlike a traditional business deal, there's all these emotions that are paramount, right? Every business deal has emotions, but the music business has kind of prevailing emotions where if you ask an artist at the wrong time for either the contract itself or for a certain condition or a pay increase or whatever, you ask them at the wrong time, you could lose the gig.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a very, very different world in that regard that I'd like everybody to come away with today with that understanding. It's like, hey, when you're making deals in anything to do with the music business, be sure to be very considerate and sensitive towards what are the dynamics going on here. Who do I present documents to? When should I present the document? And I learned from a brilliant investor when I was a really, really young kid. He said, David, I'm going to die long before you, but I don't want my advice to die. So always remember, no such thing as too early, only too late. And I've never forgotten that since I was 14 years old. And I practice it. And it means in this case that don't let a mess ensue. Don't get into the studio and you're working there for 2 months and then you bring up, hey guys, when am I getting my first paycheck? And then on the flip side, don't be so early that you jump the gun and you're making assumptions. So you really have to get a sense and a feel for like, what's the right time? When is everybody expecting to go to the table, get the business stuff over with? Because the crux of a music business deal usually has a lot of creative elements to it. And when those creative elements are flowing and they're creating the value of what the deal is there to protect in the first place, you don't want the business stuff getting in the way. So you do have to have a balance of both. Was that kind of clear? Did you understand that?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like, too, that the people that you're dealing with, these artists, they're people that are being asked to do and give a lot of themselves by a lot of different people.
All the time.
They're being pulled in many different directions. And if you have to be sensitive to that, because you don't want to come off as just another one of these people that's like, hey, what's in it for me? Can you do this for me? So you have to be diplomatic and know your audience.
That's it. No, that's perfectly, Brian, that's perfectly recapped. And that's really what people have to take from this. And if they do, just that one bit of advice we've been talking about, you'll have something of huge value for your entire life and career.
And the Audio One business that you have of building these studios, do you find that the studio business has changed or been hurt by the advent of these basically laptop recording studios that people are able to put together? Has that hurt your business, or are you adapting in a way to kind of still be able to be in that space and be successful in terms of building studios?
Well, I'm building what you would classify as real studios. So
Right.
they're proper spaces to make records or do podcasts or do production, whatever it is that's needed. And a proper space has good isolation. It has good acoustics inside of it. It has, a myriad of elements that define it as a professional workplace. And that's something that's always going to be needed. There's no question that people might have been inclined a little bit more years ago to go with a simpler setup if like they can now, having a choice. but it doesn't negate the fact or change the fact much that that you still need pro studios in a lot of applications.
Yeah.
So that's what I do, and the demand's still there. It's one of those things that there'll always be a demand for it. You got colleges, and you've got houses of worship, and you've got professional producers and songwriters and artists. All of these spaces need proper creative spaces. They need recording spaces. They need acoustically treated spaces. There's no way around that. And a lot of people don't want to go to a commercial external room to do it, or it's not even feasible for them to do that. Like in the case of a college, you don't want to have to send somebody off campus to another place to go to a quote unquote studio. You want to have that right there, under control. So there'll always be a need for what I do with studios. I think we've seen the heyday pass. There was definitely, like with everything that has to do with technology and cutting edge, sea changes. There's always a time where it's a big rush, like everybody's excited and it's new. So that phase is past, but it's leveled off, and there's plenty of people and plenty of clients that need studios.
Well, it sounds like the core elements of what it takes to have an album sound good are never going to change in terms of acoustics and insulating one room from another, and that'll always be there. And then now we have this global pandemic happening, which I would imagine would even create more demand for building home studios.
Yeah.
Because people are going to be like, hey, I need to get work done, but I'm not going to go travel all the way across Los Angeles to go to some studio where, and you can have control over that environment and get professional quality audio out of your own home studio.
You're right. And it would seem to me that would be what happens. It still has to, that chapter, we're at page 1 of. So we'll see how it plays out. But it would make perfect sense that in a time like this, where there's tremendous amount of quarantining and isolation going on, that people would want to have those kinds of spaces. And certainly all the studios I build are private, and they're very safe, of course. They're a very controlled environment, unlike a commercial space. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens with that and, how it plays out.
So the artists that you've worked with, I'll just go through the list that I've done on my research here. The Rolling Stones, Ringo Starr, Elton John, Sting, Journey, Styx, Phil Collins, Shakira, Rascal Flatts, Chick Corea. The list goes on. Are any of these artists people that were influences to you when you were growing up, so that you were starstruck in any way when you were working with them, or had you sort of moved past that starstruck stage of that everybody has, I think, when you finally were working with these artists?
Well, many of them were huge influences on me. Virtually everybody you mentioned on that list, and a lot more as well, who I've had the chance to work with and who have been inspirations for me, and some that I have not had the chance to work with that have been inspirations to me. Yeah, 100%. And I was starstruck at the beginning because, especially when I started with Aerosmith, and like the first time I worked with Elton John, these guys were and still are musical heroes of mine. And so it was very exciting, really. But I think coming from such humble beginnings, when I met them, I was a fan, but I was also so focused and so grateful to be there that I really wanted to contribute and wanted to be a part of it. I just was taught really early on by my parents. It's like, you either go in there and you get a picture with them, which at that time was a big deal, right? Because people didn't even really carry cameras and there were no cell phones. But the concept is the point of the story. It's like you can go in and get a picture with them, get their autograph, shake their hand, or you can go in there and be a peer of theirs. And you can go in and you can earn your stripes. And later on, if it works out, you'll get all the pictures you want. But bigger than that is you'll be able to call them clients of yours, friends of yours, collaborators of yours. And that's much greater than any kind of fan thing that's what they taught me, right? That had to be learned and understood, and I had to be aware of that, and I was, and so I was able to, just go in there and get the job done for all these different artists, and not really be frozen or put off or intimidated. If anything, excited and motivated, and always driven. I just always had a lot of drive and ambition. They always say everything works out for the best, whether we like it or not. What happens is what happens. And, we got to make the best of that and see it for what it is, because it's the only thing we got is whatever happened. And when I look back, coming from very little, as far as having means and opportunities, of course, no connections, that was really hard, but it ended up being amazing jet fuel for the future. So it was almost like a necessary thing that, like, okay, you're gonna come from nowhere and nothing, but through hard work and through focus and passion and consistency, you're going to get somewhere in a field that you love, not a traditional, like, grinded out job, like, I hate to be here, but in something that you actually love every day and are very blessed to do. And I think that because of that, that had a huge impact on when I was working with these artists. I was thinking about, to some extent, like, I got to keep this gig. Like, I want to keep the gig, but I also have to keep the gig, right? So, like, I was been working on a book for a while. It'll be my fourth book, if you can believe it. I already have 3 books out, but it's called No Plan B. And essentially, it's kind of the story of my life where, I never looked at anything like, if this doesn't work out, then I'll do this other thing. No, I always looked at it like, this is going to work out.
Right.
There is no other thing. And I was half fooling myself and half absolutely right. And so I just never wanted to go back to just the type of environment and upbringing of, hanging on the streets, seeing where the kids didn't go anywhere, and having very few options, not practicing your passion, kind of getting stuck in a job, like that whole blue collar suburbia, lower class kind of upbringing. I didn't like it, and I wanted to be on a stage. I wanted to play. I wanted to be a great drummer. I wanted to make music. I wanted to contribute. I wanted to do artistic projects and make deals and work with my idols and just try to, accomplish something bigger in my lifetime than anybody previously had in my family, and bigger than even myself in, say, like, writing the books, to where after I'm gone, there's going to be 3 books for people to read that wouldn't be here if I hadn't been alive. That's a bigger legacy to me than, just doing projects and just working on certain things. Like, same thing with the music. If I look at Get a Grip, over 20 million copies sold, being a part of when Crying was written, and Crazy, and Living on the Edge, and, all these songs that are going to way outlast all of us here today on this podcast and listening. And to me, that was the contribution that I wanted to make and what I work on making every day.
Nice. It's interesting that you have this book title, No Plan B, because I was interviewed on a podcast a couple weeks ago, and I think it'll be coming out shortly, about, they were asking about lessons that I learned talking to folks like you, because I talk to artists, musicians, and writers and filmmakers. And they're like, what's the common denominator with these people that you talk to, these creatives? How do they get there? How do they become successful? And even though I didn't use the words no plan B, that was the idea of my answer, because that's what I've gleaned from talking to passionate artists. They don't go into it thinking, well, let's just see if this works out.
Not at all.
Maybe I can make a living out of this. It's just, there are no other options. This is what I'm doing. This is my passion. This is what I care about. And I think when you have that attitude, you're going to find a way to earn a living from that. You may not be a superstar. You may not be, platinum album artist or an Oscar-winning film director, even though I've interviewed an Oscar-winning film director, and that was her attitude. But it's really profound how common that that characteristic is in people just like you, David. And I'm glad that you brought that up. And I would love to read that book when it comes out.
Well, start with Clint Eastwood Icon and Crash, the World's Greatest Drum Kits, which are the two that are out now of my three. So you can start with those two. But thank you for that. I'm glad that that I'm following in a path that's consistent with other people that have achieved things. And when I finish that book, I think it'll add value. The key thing for me is just always bring more value than you take.
Yeah. So tell me about the Clint Eastwood focus and why you wrote those books.
Well, I have a really great Clint Eastwood film poster and memorabilia collection, and I just felt like I wanted to share it in a way that was impactful and kind of write a book that I would want to read if I were into Clint Eastwood films or movie memorabilia or movie posters or all of the above. Mm-hmm. So I wrote that book. I got it published by a great publisher, Insight Editions, and got Clint involved, and he thought it was cool. So I got his blessing. It's all the money goes to charity from the book. And then I followed it up. My publisher, Insight, came back to me, said, look, Clint Eastwood Icon was a success. How about we do another one? So we did a revised and expanded edition of that in 2018, which is out now. Clint Eastwood Icon, revised and expanded. Clint also thought that was cool. And then the publisher came to me and said, all right, well, we've done the Clint Eastwood thing twice in 10 years. It's done really well. What else are you thinking? And of course, being a drummer and having a drum set collection and a museum as part of my foundation, Frangioni Foundation, it's a nonprofit to help kids, get music when they need it most. I wrote Crash, the World's Greatest Drum Kits, and that's another book that's just all of them coffee table books that you can really enjoy that subject in a way that if you want to read it, there's a lot of cool information. But if you just want to look at a book, a lot of times I just like to look at pictures and look at ideas visually and not necessarily have a deep read. And so my books are based around either of those. You can go deep and read all and become an expert in different aspects, or you can just have fun and look at the pictures, and it never gets old. And they're available on Amazon. They're available at Barnes & Noble. So everywhere you would buy a book, you can find Clint Eastwood Icon and Crash, the World's Greatest Drum Kits. And the money for all of them, not just Clint Eastwood's books, but Crash, goes to charity.
That charity of involving children and getting kids involved in music sounds so important right now because of the cut in funding in arts and in music especially that has been going on for decades.
Yep.
And it's just it's a real shame that we aren't seeing more arts programs actually have additional funding. Let's keep them at the same funding or add more as opposed to cutting the funding.
It's true,
because we're really suffering in the talking about education. I just want to thank you for focusing on the arts with your charity for kids and music, especially for kids. I think it adds so much value to their lives, and they carry it with them for throughout adulthood, and they pass it on themselves. And I know we're running out of time, so I want to ask you one last question. There's so much more to talk about. Maybe we can have a second chat down the road.
Let's do a volume 2. It's been great, Ryan, and the audience is great, and I think we have a lot more we can share in number 2.
So let me ask you one question. I would be remiss if I didn't ask this, because Neil Peart was a huge influence for me growing up. Rush was, I think, my favorite band starting in grade school all the way through college and beyond. I have one poster in my weight room, and it's a Rush poster. And I know you have an article on your website about his passing and what he meant to you. Can you tell our listeners what Neil Peart meant to you and how he influenced you as an artist and a drummer?
Well, Neil Peart was a huge, huge influence, has been my whole life and career. I first saw him when I was in high school. I think I was 15, probably, sophomore maybe in high school, very, very young, and had already been listening to his records. And it was the Moving Pictures tour. And the funny thing is, I just remember normally the concert, you want the first 10 rows, but Rush concerts, as I would learn at that time and going forward, the seats on the side closest to Neil, even if you were in the balcony, were the ones that sold out first. So it was really funny. And so I got pretty good seats. And I remember him, first time I ever saw him live and doing his drum solo and just not believing what I saw. Like, it was hard to even comprehend where to start after hearing and seeing him play live. It just showed me how unlimited the instrument can be when you really master it and how far you can take it. And it was like when I saw Buddy Rich or heard Carl Palmer for the first time, you struggle with practicing harder or quitting. When you see and hear somebody that phenomenal that's taken the instrument to a place that, never mind, you never even imagined, like it wasn't even in your thought process. And Neil Peart represented that. And that's to his credit, to be one of the icons and inspirations forever. Mm-hmm. And to be in that hallowed group of drummers with, Carl Palmer and Buddy Rich and Dave Weckl and, Vinnie Colaiuta and just the greatest drummers, Joe Morello, Louis Bellson, the greatest drummers that'll ever live, was, a real testament, and we're going to miss him. And Neil was so extraordinary. He left us with so much content, educational material, articles, of course, all the recorded works, tremendous amount of really, really well done video concerts that Rush put out that Neil was a big part of. So you literally could spend, however old you are right now listening to this podcast, you could spend the rest of your life just going through all of the things that Neil left us and truly be challenged and inspired for your entire life. It's incredible.
Yeah. And his contribution to lyrics too. I mean, he's such a literate guy.
Absolutely.
To have that type of knowledge of literature. And so I'm still grieving.
We
over
will
that
be for a
loss.
long time,
David,
man. We really will. You never really get over a loss that big. You just find better coping mechanisms as time goes on because it's a natural healer.
Well, I'm so glad that we were able to connect today. I know there's a lot going on in the world with the virus, and everybody's isolating and quarantining, and here you are spending time with me, and my listeners are really going to appreciate it too. So thank you, David Frangioni, for your time, and be well.
Well, thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for listening. No contact will have to be initiated physically to go to davidfrangioni.com. It's virus-free. You're safe to go there. So anybody that wants to correspond, you can find me at davidfrangioni.com and my socials at davidfrangioni. And it's been a real honor and privilege to spend the time here together with everyone. And thank you, Brian. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Hey, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Dreampath podcast. If so, I have a favor to ask. Can you go to your favorite podcast service and give me a rating and review? Your feedback is what keeps this podcast going. I appreciate your time, and as always, go find your dream path.